The New Norm is brought to you by Winning at Home. I'm Steve Norman. Welcome to The New Norm. I was in prison once. Let me explain. I was doing a church internship in Tucson, Arizona. And one of the families at the church that I was serving, the father worked at a prison. And he asked me once if I would like to have a tour. So he took me on a tour of all the different cell block wings, and he led me to a particular cell, and he said, "Let me lock you in for a bit so you can see how it feels." So the heavy metal door clanged shut, and I heard the key click in the lock. And I think I was there for all of about 2 minutes. And it was amazing how quiet it was, and how even though he had just left my company, I felt horribly alone. And I remember saying at that point, "I think I'm done. Come and let me out now." I don't know where you feel like you're done and that you need God to come and let you out. It could be that you feel like your marriage is unraveling or your illness isn't relenting, or you've got a child who keeps veering from the path that you wish they would walk. It feels like you're stuck on the hamster wheel at work. You just keep going around and around and around. And today I want us to look at a man who's stuck in prison, and he doesn't know if or when he'll get out. And that character's name is Joseph, and we need a little backstory to see how he landed there. Genesis chapter 37, verses 3 through 8, we read this. "Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age. And he made an ornate robe for him, and when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, 'Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it.' His brothers said to him, 'Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?' And they hated him all the more because of his dream and because of what he had said." It's important to note here that Joseph comes from a deeply dysfunctional family. He's got 10 brothers that are born to 3 different mothers. And he's the first son of his father's favorite wife, who died giving birth to his younger brother. And his dad is guilty of blatant favoritism. He gives Joseph an ornate cloak. Some scholars said it wasn't just decoration, it was the cut of the fabric that made it stand out. Some people say that only princesses or noblemen had robes with long sleeves that went all the way down to the ankles. So not only does his dad have a favorite son, but he publicly identifies Joseph as the favorite son. How many of you out there have siblings? And how many of you have ever argued over who is the favorite? See, in this story, Joseph's father is guilty of blatant favoritism, and Joseph is guilty of unchecked narcissism. He says to his brothers, "One day you'll all bow down to me." Now, it's one thing for him to receive the coat. It's another thing for him to wear it. Every single day he put that on, he's sticking his finger in their eyes. It's one thing to have a dream about your destiny. It's another to share it publicly with people who feel threatened by you being the rising star. Make no mistake. Joseph is not a happy-go-lucky teenager with an eye for ancient fashion. He is a self-centered, self-promoting, attention-seeking brat. That said, even his worst behavior doesn't warrant what his brothers are about to do to him. At 17, his father sent him to check on his brothers who are watching sheep in another town. And when they see him on the horizon, they know that it's him from a distance, because they can see the silhouette of that dumb jacket from far, far away. And then they come up with a plan. They say, "Let's kidnap him." And then they do, and they throw him into a pit. And some of his brothers are actually saying, "Let's go one step further. Let's kill him. Then we're rid of him forever." But his older brother says, "No, let's sell him." So they sell him to traveling merchants and slave traders. They take the coat, they tear it up, they cut it, they dip it in blood, and they send it back to his father, as if to indicate that he's been mauled to death by a wild animal. At that point, he's taken to a different country, Egypt, with a new language and a new culture. And he's given a job working for an Egyptian official, Potiphar, who is the captain of the king's guard. And apparently he does this for years, and he does it well until his boss's wife propositions him. He turns her down day after day until one day she tries to seduce him and he runs out of the room. And as he flees, she grabs a hold of his coat that he leaves behind in her hands. Genesis 39 says this, "She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story, 'That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house.' But when his master heard the story his wife told him, saying, 'This is how your slave treated me,' he burned with anger. And Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, where the king's prisoners were confined." Some scholars believe that Potiphar was also in charge of overseeing all official executions. If that's true, then he's killed before without hesitation. And he probably could have killed his own slave without any consequences at all. So what's interesting is that Joseph is alive to actually be sent to prison. That he's put in the royal prison is evidence that Potiphar might not entirely be buying his wife's story. This is the second time in a decade that Joseph is literally stripped of his clothes, unjustly imprisoned, and thrown in a pit. Surprisingly, Joseph is able to maintain his sanity and his well-being in a very difficult season. And I believe that he gives us 3 examples of how to survive in prison or in seasons of uncertainty. And they are these: to feel the presence, to find the perspective, and to fight the power. The first is to feel the presence. Joseph can survive this season because he knows he's not alone. Listen to what the scriptures say in Genesis 39, verse 20. "But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all of those held in prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did." Verse 21, "The Lord was with him." Verse 23, "The Lord was with Joseph." God doesn't always get us out of the pit, but he always joins us there. Sometimes God permits hardship, but God is always present in that hardship with us. To know that God is present and to feel that God is present are 2 different things. Remember one time my daughter, our youngest Miriam, was playing in the basement, and I was down there with her when she started playing. But when I started to go up the stairs, she said, "You're not leaving me here, are you?" See, cognitively, I know that God is with me, but emotionally, it's easy for me to feel abandoned. Joseph made an evidence list. He said, "Here's how I know that God is with me. He rescued me when I was about to die. He gave me success in all that I did. And he gave me favor with my boss." He has a running mental list of all of the ways that he knows that God has not left him. Have you ever considered doing that? Like maybe right now, you feel stuck. You feel like you're in a tumultuous time. But what if you were to pause every day in this season to recount the ways that God has been faithful to you? To acknowledge the ways that God is with you? To admit that God has shown kindness to you here and God has given you favor even though things aren't working out as you would choose? So if you're stuck today, ask God this question: will you show me your presence? Ask God this question: will you remind me of the very specific ways that I can know that you're here with me? Where have you experienced the presence of God in the past? And how might you experience it again? See, Joseph doesn't just feel God's presence, he finds God's perspective. In Genesis chapter 40, we read this: "Sometime later, the cupbearer and baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his 2 officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. And the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended to them. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials, who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you look so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there is no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, "In my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. And as soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand." "This is what it means," Joseph said to him. "The 3 branches are 3 days, and within 3 days Pharaoh will lift your head and will restore you to your position. And you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even though I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." And when the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, "I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." "This is what it means," Joseph said. "The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh." Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast to all his officials. And he lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so that he once again put the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to him in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. When we're in a season of waiting, it's easy to see the world with blinders on. We see our struggle, our pain, our limitations, our inconvenience. And we block out others who are also hurting, also lonely, also scared. And if we're not careful, we'll miss opportunities in the waiting to encourage others who are waiting as well. About 15 years ago, I ended up in the hospital. I'd been working out at the gym and suddenly had this knifing pain in my chest. A friend called an ambulance and they rushed me to a hospital. Turns out I had what they call a spontaneous pneumothorax, which is like what happens when your lung collapses. And after they put in a chest tube, they put me in a shared hospital room. And because our daughter was only 2, my wife Kelly couldn't stay with me. And I remember feeling cold, uncomfortable, scared, and terribly alone. And I remember complaining to God, "I don't want to be here." But there was a guy on the other side of that curtain, and for some reason, he and I started a conversation with one another in our more quiet moments. And I remember asking him when I learned his name, "Hey, Jack, is it okay if I come over and read scripture with you?" And so I did. I got out of my bed and I shuffled over to the other side of the curtain and I read the Psalms for both of us because we both needed to hear them. Perspective reminds us that we're not alone, that God has us in the season not just for something that we need to learn, but God has us in the season so that we can be a gift to others who are in it too. So Joseph finds God's presence, he finds God's perspective, and then finally he finds God's power to fight despair, even though he has every reason to give up. The people who can help him don't. In Genesis chapter 40, verse 23, we read, "The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him." But Joseph won't let go. He continues to hang on to hope. Business writer Jim Collins writes about the tenacity of Admiral James Stockdale, a prisoner of war in Vietnam. Stockdale was tortured and held in an infamous prison in Hanoi for 7 years. And Stockdale says this, "I never lost faith in the end of the story. I never doubted not only that I would get out, but that I would prevail in the end. and turned that experience into the defining event in my life, which in retrospect I would not trade. Collins asked Stockdale about the personal characteristics of the prisoners who did not make it out of the camp. And Stockdale said the guys who didn't survive were the optimists. They were the ones who said, we're going to be out by Christmas, and Christmas would come and Christmas would go. Then they would say, we're going to be out by Easter, and Easter would come and Easter would go. Then Thanksgiving, and then it would be Christmas again, and then they died of a broken heart. This is a very important lesson. You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you cannot afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. This is hard, and it's important for us to acknowledge that if we're in a hard season, it is nothing other than difficult. But it's important to say, I choose to believe that God is with me and God is for me, that by His grace I will prevail. It's in the waiting that my resolve is strengthened. It's in the waiting that my hope is anchored. It's in the waiting that my soul is stretched. And it's in the waiting that my faith is enriched. The rest of the story continues like this in Genesis chapter 41. When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. And in the morning his mind was troubled, so he sent for all the magicians and the wise men of Egypt, and Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. And the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, today I'm reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was angry once with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, but no one can interpret it. But I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. I can't, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Joseph went on to interpret the dream, and the dream came with a plan that would spare Egypt from being utterly devastated by a famine. And that plan seemed good to Pharaoh and his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, this Joseph, one in whom is the spirit of the gods? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made this known to you, and there is no one as discerning and as wise as you, you shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, make way! Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Here's the trick with waiting. We never know when the circumstances will shift. Joseph didn't have any notice that his life was about to change, but he went from the prison to the palace in a matter of minutes. In his mercy, God stripped Joseph of the family robe and met him in a pit. In his mercy, God stripped Joseph of his career robe and met him in a prison. And in his mercy, God stripped Joseph of his prison robe and brought him to the palace. He lost the only thing that he knew to gain something he never could have imagined. And in the end, it's more than his brothers. It's an entire nation that revered and honored him. Sometimes we want to believe that when the circumstances change, we'll change. But the truth is that Joseph experienced an internal transformation before his external transformation ever took place. So the question isn't, when will I get out of this prison? It's, what kind of person will I be when God chooses to release me? The New Norm is produced and distributed by Winning at Home. Winning at Home is a faith-based nonprofit committed to making individuals, couples, families, and businesses stronger through counseling and coaching. For more information, visit winningathome.com. I'm your host, Steve Norman. Thanks for listening.